follows an extract from my book Fête Fatale, available from Amazon. Chapter 6, Part 3. Detective Chief Inspector Benedict James of Winsford Police HQ, Cheshire, was sitting at Beth's kitchen table cradling a steaming mug of hot coffee in his cupped hands. His whole demeanour brought to mind solid oak. It wasn't merely the fact that he wore a brown checked shirt with brown corduroy trousers. His entire stature was one of solidity. He was tall and broad with thick-set limbs, his brown hair, which was becoming peppered with a distinguished grey, and his gentle brown eyes confirmed the impression, but it was more to do with the aura of rock-solid dependability. There was a penetrating shrewdness in his gaze, but the wrinkles around the edges of his eyes hinted at a kindness and a willingness to smile given half a chance. Beth was positively diminutive when standing next to her twin. In childhood, it was common in mixed-sex twins for the girl to be born the biggest. This had been the case with Beth and Benedict, but as soon as Benedict's years hit double figures, he made up for lost time and soon towered over his sister, and very little of their early physical similarities remained. However, the mutual bond of understanding had not diminished. Very few words needed to be spoken, and subtleties in conversation between them were quickly comprehended. They were now discussing the untimely demise of John Barlow. Drew met Dr. Wainwright on his way to begin his morning surgery and was told that he was meeting with Bobby Maddox this lunchtime. They're hoping to pin down a suitable cause of death. As there was no serious medical history and nobody witnessed to the death, it isn't plain sailing. I think they're hoping to thrash it out today so that they can give Fred Brough the go-ahead to begin the funeral preparations, said Beth. Do you think they'd mind if I stepped along and stuck my nose in for a while? Asked Benedict. I'm sure they'd be glad of your advice, but I don't think there's much to attract your curiosity. You know me, I can't resist meddling. If I see a couple of loose strands, I can't help but give them a pull. Do you mind if I abandon you for a while? I won't be long and I'll keep you up to date with the gossip, as far as professional etiquette allows, of course. Benedict gave his sister a wry smile which suggested that he was prepared to significantly stretch the boundaries of professional etiquette. Nevertheless, he knew from past experience that Beth could keep a secret. Of course, you go off to play. I'll get my head around what to do with these meringue bases until you get back. Come back for some lunch if you can. Inspector James walked into the waiting room of the doctor's surgery and explained to the receptionist that he knew the doctor was in a meeting with Sergeant Maddox, but would she please interrupt the meeting and say that DCI James of Winsford HQ would like to join them. He was sure that it would be okay and they wouldn't mind her interrupting them. He knew that if he hadn't added the full weight of his title, she would never have considered breaking protocol. The mention of Police HQ did the job, and he was soon escorted into the consulting room. Surrounded by blood pressure cuffs, plastic models of the heart and the digestive system, and other medical paraphernalia, sat Sergeant Maddox, endeavouring to spread out the relevant examples of the paperwork he'd found earlier that day. He and Dr. Wainwright happily greeted Inspector James and drew up a chair at the already cramped desk so that he could join them. Hello, James. How good of you to join us. Surely you can't be here in an official capacity, said Dr. Wainwright, glancing over James' decidedly unofficial attire. Goodness me, no, said James. Beth has been telling me all about it, and because I was on the spot, so to speak, I couldn't resist sticking my nose in. How are you getting along? I've looked into John's appearance when we found him dead. Maddox has the photographs here if you want to see. I can say quite certainly that he died of a heart attack. That's the easy bit. You can see his face is the classic cherry red. My problem is that I can't suggest what caused the heart attack. The death certificate stipulates the need to state an underlying cause, as you know. In other cases, I could put myocardial infarction owing to diabetes mellitus type 2. But in this instance, I really don't think that will do. John had absolutely no history of heart disease and had only the mild onset of type 2 diabetes, which was well regulated. He'd had no sort of diabetic episode at all. Our only other line of explanation would be that of undue stress. There's no doubt that extreme stress can do strange things to a man, and so that's what we're searching for evidence of now, said Wainwright. You're absolutely right not to jump to conclusions. For all we know, he might have swallowed 2 bottles of paracetamol that morning in an attempt to get out of judging the poultry competition, said James. I know that you're joking, but I'd made the same joke last night. I suppose it isn't a joking matter, but it raises new possibilities, doesn't it, said Maddox. Don't you worry about joking, young man. In our job, it's the only way to cope. There's no disrespect in it. Nevertheless, sometimes it brings to light avenues you might otherwise have missed. There's always a surprise around the corner, said James. It's strange that you should say that. When John died, I remembered my medical tutor telling me, always be ready to be surprised. That's the problem with John's death. I am surprised. I certainly didn't expect him to die, and I can't think why he did. I have no alternative explanation for his death, but I can't honestly sign the death certificate as things stand now. I don't know what to think, said Wainwright. From what I knew of him, I don't honestly think that John Barlow was the type to commit suicide, but as I have no reasonable explanation, I'm sorry to say that I think I'll have to refer the case to the coroner. I'm sorry for Jean, but it's my neck on the line if I submit shoddy paperwork. What's your advice, James? I suppose that you'll get referred to Winsford in the end, which is my patch, so I might as well jump in straight away as I'm here. I'll give the office a call now and speak to the coroner to get things moving right away. If you'll just excuse me for a moment, I'll step into the corridor and make some calls. As DCI James naturally assumed command, Sergeant Maddox sagged with relief. I'm so glad Inspector James is here. I don't like to think of facing Jean Barlow with the news without some stiff hierarchy behind me. She won't dare argue with him, though, he said. It may not amount to much. Just because the case has been referred to the coroner, it doesn't necessarily mean that any further investigation will be required. Nevertheless, I quite agree with you. I'm glad to have Detective Chief Inspector James at my back, agreed Wainwright. Some 10 minutes later, James walked back into the room and gave a nod in answer to their inquiring glances. I've spoken to the coroner, and after outlining the basics of the situation, he's given me the go-ahead to begin a few preliminary inquiries. We both agree that our first port of call is to get a full toxicology report. That should end matters once and for all, or it will give us a clue as to what we do next. I'll give some of the chaps at HQ a call and they can whiz over with their various syringes, but it'll take weeks of bending over petri dishes before they come through with any results, if there are any to be found. It all seems a bit drastic, don't you think? Said Maddox. That depends upon what you think is drastic. We certainly can't make up the death certificate for a quiet life, and we'll just have to do a bit of digging in the meantime. Now don't think that I've come along to take over. I'm just here to lend a hand and give a bit of weight where I can to speed things along. I've spoken to your boss, Maddox, and she's happy for you to be my wingman for the present. She just asks that you report back to her regularly and keep her informed, so don't you go getting me into trouble by ignoring her or putting her nose out of joint. The doctor and the police sergeant made it quite obvious that they were more than happy for Detective Chief Inspector Benedict James to take over. He continued to plan their strategy and suggested that while they waited for his team to arrive, they continue browsing through the material from John's office. Why don't we get back to my sister's house? We can continue there. I don't know about you, but I'm ravenous, and there isn't room to swing a cat in here, said James. Maddox stood up and began to gather the strewn paperwork, but Dr. Wainwright said that he needed to prepare for his afternoon's consulting session. Now that I can hand over the follow-up to you, James, and Maddox isn't on his own with this, I need to get back to my own work. This is your show now, but I'd be grateful if you'd keep me in the loop. Now that I've set this ball rolling, I'd like to keep an eye on it and see where it ends. If you need any medical information, you know you've only got to ask, said Wainwright. Assuring him that they'd stay in regular contact, James and Maddox left the doctor and walked back to Beth's. As they walked, Maddox gave an overview of what he'd noticed in the business documents so far. Overall, I'd say that business was a bit tricky for John just recently. I'd no idea he'd got his finger in so many pies. Generally speaking, it appears that income was drying up as overheads were mounting up. The same old story really, but on a grand scale. Tenants were getting pretty thin on the ground in Greece as the Greek government was continually increasing the property tax, which must have been reflected in the rental fees. This isn't a surprise really when you think of the euro crash from a few years ago. I'm guessing it was a familiar situation in Spain. Business in his bars must be suffering since the decline in tourism there. That's the general drift I got from the paperwork. I've got some outstanding bills, letters from the Greek tax authorities and so on, but I've no idea of the severity of the situation. You'd need an accountant to comment on that. Maybe it's desperate or maybe it's just a blip. I'd be terrified at dealing with those kind of figures, but maybe it's all just in a day's work. No doubt we'll be getting to know his accountant and solicitor quite well over the next few weeks. Was there anything else of interest? I've got John's laptop here with me, but it's password encrypted, so I don't know if there's anything there. I didn't have John down as the cyber secret type. There is one thing that did spark my interest, but I can't put my finger on why. In John's diary, on the margin of the page that was the date of the fête, alongside a note to book an optician's appointment, there was a name scribbled. I'm sure I've heard that name before, but I can't place who it is or where I've heard the name. Does C. Jefferson mean anything to you? I asked Jean and she has no idea who it is, said Maddox. James whistled through his teeth and said, I'm quite sure she didn't know the name. Well now, my oh my. It seems that our Mr. Barlow might be a bit grubbier around the edges than we all thought. For the full book of Fête Fatale, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.